In 1983, Michael Jackson acquired a chimpanzee. Not metaphorically, literally. A baby chimp from a Texas research facility, dressed in human clothes, brought to live in one of the most famous homes in America. The chimp's name was Bubbles, and for nearly a decade, Bubbles was one of Michael Jackson's closest companions. They traveled together, ate together, according to some reports, even slept in the same room. The tabloids loved it. Bubbles became almost as famous as Michael. Photos of them together were everywhere. Michael in sequined jackets, Bubbles in miniature versions of the same outfits. It looked absurd, and the world treated it as absurd. A rich eccentric playing with an exotic pet. But if you look past the spectacle, if you actually think about what it meant for a human being to build his life around a chimpanzee in a private zoo and an amusement park that almost no one used, you start to see something darker. Neverland Ranch wasn't just Michael Jackson's home. It was his attempt to create a world where he didn't have to be Michael Jackson anymore, where he could escape the pressure and the scrutiny and the loneliness that came with being the most famous person on Earth. And it failed. Not because the animals left or the rides broke down, but because you can't escape yourself by building walls, no matter how high or how expensive those walls are. This is the story of Bubbles and Neverland. But more than that, it's the story of what happens when someone tries to solve an internal problem with an external solution. When isolation masquerades as sanctuary. And when the thing you build to save yourself becomes the thing that proves you can't be saved. Michael Jackson bought Neverland Ranch in 1987 for an estimated $17 million. The property was located in Los Olivos, California, about 100 miles northwest of Los Angeles. 2,700 acres of rolling hills and oak trees. The previous owner had called it Sycamore Valley Ranch. Michael renamed it Neverland, after the fictional island in Peter Pan where children never grow up. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Michael had been performing since he was 5 years old. He'd never had a childhood in any conventional sense. And now, at 29, he was going to create one for himself. He started building almost immediately. A private amusement park with a Ferris wheel, carousel, bumper cars, and a small train that circled the property. A movie theater, an arcade filled with vintage games, and a zoo. Not a small collection of animals. A full zoo. Elephants, giraffes, orangutans, reptiles, exotic birds. At its peak, Neverland housed over 50 animals, cared for by a dedicated staff of zookeepers and veterinarians. Bubbles arrived before Neverland was fully built. Michael had met the chimp through a connection to a cancer research facility in Texas. The facility bred chimpanzees for medical testing. Bubbles was born there in 1983, and according to reports, Michael was moved by the idea of rescuing a baby chimp from a life in a lab. He paid for Bubbles, brought him to California, and integrated him into his daily life in ways that seemed bizarre to outsiders but made perfect sense to Michael. Chimps are not pets, not in any responsible sense. They're intelligent, strong, and highly social animals with complex emotional needs. In the wild, chimps live in communities, form intricate relationships, and require constant stimulation. Keeping a chimp in captivity, especially in a domestic environment, is ethically fraught. Animal welfare experts almost universally condemn it. Chimps raised by humans often develop psychological problems. They become aggressive as they mature. They can't be integrated into normal chimp societies. They exist in a kind of limbo, neither fully wild nor fully domesticated. But Michael didn't see Bubbles as a pet. Or at least, not just a pet. According to people who knew him during this period, Michael saw Bubbles as a companion, someone who didn't want anything from him except presence. Bubbles didn't care about Michael's fame, didn't ask for autographs or demand performances, didn't judge him for being strange. Bubbles just existed. And for Michael, who was constantly surrounded by people who wanted something, that uncomplicated presence was valuable. They traveled together extensively. Bubbles accompanied Michael to recording studios, to photo shoots, to Japan, where they stayed in luxury hotels and Bubbles reportedly ate at the table with Michael and his entourage. There are photos from that trip. Michael in a crisp suit, Bubbles next to him in a matching outfit, sitting calmly while cameras flash. It was treated as a publicity stunt, and maybe it was, but it was also a glimpse into how isolated Michael's life had become. His closest companion was a chimpanzee because humans had proven too complicated. Neverland was completed by the late 80s, and it became Michael's primary residence. The main house was over 13,000 square feet, Tudor-style architecture, ornate furnishings. But the real focus was outside, the amusement park, the zoo, the grounds. Michael wanted Neverland to be a place where children could come and experience joy. He invited kids from hospitals and underprivileged communities, organized parties where they could ride the rides and meet the animals and play games. He talked about Neverland in interviews as a gift, a way of sharing the childhood he never had. But there was a contradiction at the heart of the project. Neverland was supposed to be for children, but it was also Michael's refuge, a place where he controlled every variable, where the outside world couldn't reach him. He installed gates and security, limited access, created a bubble, and while children did visit, the truth is that Neverland was empty most of the time. The rides sat unused. The zoo animals lived in enclosures with minimal human interaction beyond their caretakers. It was a playground for ghosts. The staff who worked at Neverland during its peak years described it as surreal. Michael was rarely there during the day. He kept odd hours, often staying up all night and sleeping during the afternoon. The property was maintained meticulously, but it had an eerie quality. Too perfect. Too still. Like a theme park after closing time. And the animals, while well cared for in terms of food and medical attention, existed in an environment that was fundamentally unnatural. Bubbles, meanwhile, was growing up. By the early 90s, he was no longer a baby chimp. Adult male chimpanzees can weigh over 150 pounds and are several times stronger than adult humans. They have canine teeth that can cause serious injury, and as Bubbles matured, he became harder to manage. There are reports, never fully confirmed, that Bubbles started showing signs of aggression, not toward Michael specifically, but toward staff and visitors. This is common with captive chimps. As they reach adolescence and adulthood, the playful baby becomes a powerful, unpredictable animal. Michael's relationship with Bubbles began to change. They spent less time together. Bubbles was moved to a separate enclosure on the property, cared for by professional handlers. And eventually, according to multiple sources, Bubbles was relocated entirely. Not sold, not abandoned, but transferred to an animal sanctuary, the Center for Great Apes in Florida, where he's reportedly lived since the mid-90s. Michael continued to pay for Bubbles' care for the rest of his life. But the close companionship, the traveling together, the photos of them side by side, that era was over. The story of Bubbles is often told as a curiosity. Michael Jackson and his chimp. But it's more than that. It's a story about someone who was so alienated from normal human connection that he turned to animals for companionship. And not just any animals. Exotic, high-maintenance animals that required constant care and created their own set of problems. Bubbles couldn't stay a baby forever. Chimps grow up. They change. And when they do, the fantasy of uncomplicated companionship collapses. Michael's relationship with all the animals at Neverland followed a similar pattern. He acquired them because they represented something he craved. Innocence, lack of judgment, a connection that didn't require him to perform or explain himself. But animals aren't simple. They have needs. They age. They become difficult. And the more Michael tried to use them as an escape from human complexity, the more he ended up recreating the same dynamics he was trying to avoid. The animals required handlers, veterinarians, legal permits, public scrutiny. They became another performance. Another thing he had to manage. By 1993, Neverland had become both Michael's sanctuary and his prison. That was the year of the Chandler allegations. The investigation, the media circus, and Neverland, which had been a private refuge, became a crime scene. Police arrived with search warrants. They spent hours going through the property, looking in bedrooms, examining photographs, interviewing staff. The images of police at Neverland's gates were broadcast worldwide. The place Michael had built to escape scrutiny became the epicenter of it. After the Chandler case settled in 1994, Michael's relationship with Neverland grew more complicated. He still lived there, still maintained it, but it no longer felt safe. According to people close to him, he became paranoid about the property, worried that it was bugged, that staff were informants, that every visitor was a potential accuser. The walls he'd built to keep the world out started to feel like walls keeping him in, and the animals, once symbols of innocence and escape, became reminders of how strange his life had become. The public didn't see a man who loved animals. They saw a man who lived in a zoo, who dressed a chimp in human clothes, who built an amusement park nobody used. Every detail of Neverland that Michael had intended as whimsical or generous was reinterpreted as evidence of instability. The media called it a fantasy land, a place where Michael retreated from reality. And they weren't entirely wrong. The cost of maintaining Neverland was staggering. Estimates vary, but some reports suggest Michael spent several $1,000,000 a year just on upkeep. The animals alone required a full-time staff and expensive veterinary care. The rides needed maintenance, the landscaping, the security, the utilities for a property that size. And unlike a normal home, Neverland didn't generate income. It was pure expense. A monument to Michael's need for control and isolation. By the early 2000s, Michael's financial situation had become precarious. He'd spent lavishly for years. Neverland was one of many drains on his resources, and yet he couldn't let it go. Selling Neverland would have meant admitting that the experiment had failed, that the refuge he'd built hadn't saved him. So he held on, even as the costs mounted and the property became less a home and more a burden. The 2003 allegations brought police back to Neverland. This time, the search was even more invasive, and the images of officers going through Michael's bedroom, his personal spaces, were broadcast again. The trial that followed in 2005 was brutal. Michael was acquitted on all counts, but the damage was done. After the verdict, he left Neverland and never returned to live there. The property sat mostly empty. The animals were relocated to sanctuaries and zoos. The rides fell into disrepair. The place that was supposed to be Michael's escape became a ghost town. In 2008, Neverland went into foreclosure. Michael had defaulted on loans secured by the property. An auction was scheduled. At the last minute, a refinancing deal was arranged and the auction was canceled. But the message was clear. Neverland, which had cost tens of millions to build and maintain, was now a liability. Michael never set foot on the property again after leaving in 2005. He spent his final years living in rented homes in Los Angeles and Las Vegas, planning a comeback that never happened. When Michael died in June 2009, Neverland was still in limbo. The animals were long gone. The rides were rusting. The property was overgrown. It was eventually sold in 2020 to a billionaire for about $22 million, a fraction of what Michael had spent on it. The new owner reportedly has no interest in preserving it as a Michael Jackson landmark. It's just land now. Expensive California real estate. So what do we make of Bubbles and Neverland? What do they tell us about Michael Jackson? On one level, there are symptoms of wealth and eccentricity. A rich man buying exotic animals and building an amusement park because he can. But on a deeper level, they're evidence of profound loneliness. Michael Jackson was surrounded by people his entire life. Family, staff, fans, collaborators, and yet he felt alone, misunderstood, incapable of connecting in normal ways. So he created an environment where connection didn't require vulnerability, where he could control every interaction, where the beings around him, human and animal, existed on his terms. But that kind of control is itself a prison. When you build walls to keep the world out, you also trap yourself inside. And when your closest relationships are with animals and employees, people who are literally dependent on you, you never have to risk real intimacy, real challenge, real growth. You can stay exactly as you are, which is both the appeal and the tragedy. Bubbles couldn't stay a baby chimp. The animals at Neverland couldn't remain frozen in innocent simplicity. And Michael couldn't escape the fact that he was a human being with human problems that required human solutions. No amount of money or isolation or control could change that. And the more he tried to create a world where those problems didn't exist, the more he reinforced his separation from the world he actually lived in. There's a particular cruelty in how the public reacted to Neverland. Michael built it with genuine intentions. He wanted to share joy. He wanted to create something beautiful. And the public, instead of seeing generosity, saw pathology. They saw a man who couldn't grow up, who surrounded himself with children and animals because he was too damaged to relate to adults. And while there's truth in that interpretation, it's also reductive. It strips away the context. The decades of exploitation, the childhood spent performing instead of playing, the constant surveillance, the inability to trust anyone. Michael Jackson didn't build Neverland because he was a pedophile or a predator, despite what some accusers and critics have suggested. He built it because he was profoundly lonely and didn't know how else to address that loneliness. And when the accusations came, when Neverland became associated with scandal instead of wonder, it destroyed the one place he'd tried to make safe. The refuge became the crime scene. The sanctuary became evidence. And Michael, who'd poured his resources and his dreams into the property, lost it long before he physically left. The animals were, in a way, the most honest part of Neverland. They didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. Bubbles was a chimpanzee. The elephants were elephants. They didn't perform emotions or lie or betray, but they also couldn't give Michael what he actually needed. Companionship? Yes. But not understanding, not partnership. Not the kind of connection that requires two people to see each other fully and choose to stay anyway. Michael surrounded himself with animals because animals don't judge. But they also don't challenge. They don't push you to grow or change or confront uncomfortable truths about yourself. And in that sense, Neverland was less a refuge and more an avoidance. A very expensive, very elaborate way of not dealing with the actual problems in Michael's life. His relationship with his family, his inability to trust, his addiction to control, his fear of being seen as he actually was rather than as the image he projected. After Michael's death, Bubbles became a symbol. Not of Michael's eccentricity, though that's still part of the story, but of what happens when you try to force something unnatural to work. Bubbles lived in Michael's world for as long as it was possible, and when it stopped being possible, when Bubbles grew too large and too strong and too complicated, he was sent away. Not cruelly. Michael continued to pay for his care, but the relationship ended, the fantasy collapsed, and Bubbles, according to reports from the sanctuary where he now lives, is doing well. He's integrated into a group of chimps. He paints, apparently. He has routines. He's no longer wearing human clothes or traveling the world or being photographed with one of the most famous people who ever lived. He's just a chimpanzee in a sanctuary, living out his life in a way that's as close to natural as captivity allows. There's something bittersweet about that. Bubbles survived Michael, outlived him, and found a kind of peace that Michael never did. Because Bubbles, unlike Michael, was eventually allowed to stop performing, to stop being a symbol, to just exist. The broader lesson of Neverland, if there is one, is about the limits of escape. You can buy land, build walls, fill your life with distractions and dependencies, but you can't buy your way out of loneliness. You can't build a structure that makes psychological pain disappear. And the more you try, the more you invest in external solutions to internal problems, the more you reinforce the thing you're trying to escape. Michael Jackson spent tens of millions of dollars building Neverland, and it didn't save him. It didn't make him happy. It didn't give him the childhood he missed or the peace he craved. It gave him a place to hide. And hiding, while sometimes necessary, is not the same as healing. In the end, Neverland became one more thing Michael lost, one more dream that didn't deliver, one more piece of evidence that no amount of money or control or fantasy could fix what was broken inside him. And Bubbles, the chimp who started it all, who represented Michael's first major attempt to find companionship outside the human world, ended up in a sanctuary, living the life of a chimp. which is what he always should have been allowed to do. Michael Jackson died believing he was misunderstood, and maybe he was. But he also spent his life running from the one thing that might have actually helped. Connection. Real connection. The kind that requires vulnerability and risk and the possibility of rejection. He built Neverland to avoid that risk, and in doing so, he guaranteed his own isolation. The rides are gone now. The animals are gone. The property has been sold. And Bubbles, the chimp who once sat next to Michael Jackson in matching outfits, is painting in a sanctuary in Florida, living a life that has nothing to do with fame or performance or the desperate loneliness of the most watched man on earth. Maybe that's the only happy ending this story has, that at least one of them got out.